Good evening, everybody. It's March the 26th, the day after Pope Francis consecrated Russia and Ukraine to the Immaculate Heart of Mary in fulfilment of the request of Our Lady of Fatima. And it seemed like a good time to do an introductory talk of my latest enormous book, which is the Holy Book of Thoth, the Great Arcane of the Tarot, the work of Vladimir Shmakov. And this contains some wonderful illustrations, including the front cover by a wonderful Russian artist, Arcane. So I'll start by reading the foreword. I think it's short. It kind of helps to get me going. I'm honoured to present for the first time in English the Holy Book of Thoth, the Great Arcane of the Tarot, which was written and published first by Vladimir Alexeyevich Shmakov, who lived in Moscow from around 1880s until 1929, by which point he'd moved to Argentina, and he published his book in 1916 in Russian. This completes a triad, or turner, as they might say, of legendary Russian magi, whose work I began to publish in English in January 2020. I began with the Tarot Majors and Tarot Minors courses of GeoMeebs, followed by Nina Rudnikova's The Solar Way in 1921, and now Shmakov's first book on the spring equinox of 2022. So we have 20, 21, or 0, and 22, which as it happens are the numbers of the final great turner of the Arcana, which are the Judgment, the Fool, and the World. What eventful years these have been, though not more eventful than those of exactly a century ago, which the Russian intelligentsia who strove to preserve the hidden wisdom teachings from the Red Terror were given to live through. This is my tribute and memorial to their devoted efforts, which have not been forgotten, and nor will they be lost, as the inexorable passage of time carves out its course. At the head of each arcanum are images by Mikhail Matsushin, a student of Shmakov who stood at the head of one of 3 schools of the Russian avant-garde in St. Petersburg. These images adorned the original Holy Book of Thoth produced by Shmakov in 1916. I'll just find an example. These are poor quality reproductions because I don't know where the originals are of these. So, it's a massive preface. So, this is an example of his tarot images there. That's the magician. And this present volume is published with gratitude for the counsel, conversation, support and friendship of Alice, Billy, Paul and Eugenie, who's Arcane, and of course many other people. It's just that they happened to be subject to my kind of questions and, asking them about the front cover, asking them to help me with specific words, and just, were there while I was completing this project. And since the book came out, there are many other people who've been incredibly supportive. They've bought the book, they're in the process of reading it. And I myself, this is, just because I've published it does not mean that I have managed to comprehend, absorb and assimilate everything that's in this book. Editing is a very different task to really learning this, and Shmakov, he's considered difficult by even professional Russian philosophers. He's really a lost genius, I would say. I think lost in the sense that he's unknown in the English-speaking world. But he does have students in Russia, including Arcane. And this really goes to the essence of the Russian mind. It's quite unique. So I'm going to skip now to the afterword, which was part of my contribution to the book rather than Shmakov's own words, just to explain a little bit of my thinking behind the project and where it came from. Vladimir Alexeyevich Shmakov entered a doorway in my mind whilst I was reading about the mysterious group of occultists working in Russia before the Bolshevik Revolution, which were described in Meditations on the Tarot as such. I have mentioned some hermeticists whom I suppose that you, dear unknown friend, know of. But there are many others who ought to be named as guardians of the ancient tradition of the Arcanum of inspiration. But what will the name of Shmakov say to you, for example, or the name Rodnikova? These are names which, like the yellow leaves of autumn, repose in forgetfulness beneath the immense white shroud of snow which covers pre-revolutionary Russia. That's from the 14th Arcanum of Meditations on the Tarot, Temperance. And then later he writes in the Fall, this was in 1920. It was then that the one who is writing these lines, although he had already studied the masterly book by the engineer Shmakov, the major arcana of the tarot, a book almost twice as large as, for example, Oswald Worth's Les Tarot des Images de Moyen Age or Paul Marteau's Le Tarot de Marseille, and the book on tarot by P.D. Ouspensky in 1917, was struck to learn to what degree collective work on the tarot can be fruitful for study, research, training and advancement in the esoteric domain. So this is where I first heard of Shmakov. And this would have been probably 25 years ago. The author goes on to explain that whilst members of the Russian occult school initiated him into the heights and depths of their lore, after decades of private study he developed his own, presumably different interpretations of the tarot keys and their relation to the Hebrew letters by members, especially Nina Rodnikova, who was the leader of the Russian emigre group in Estonia, who'd escaped from the Bolshevik Revolution. She was the leading pupil of Geo Mead, the master of the group, and she had all the inner circle teachings, and she and Tomberg became friends, and she told him everything that she could about this school that were working with him. And so what the author of MOT is saying is that he's moved on, even though their teachings were within him as a general impulse, which he kept with him over the decades and through the many trials of his own life, that he came to have some different ideas and interpretations of the tarot, which people who've studied his book and studied these books will see that whilst there are some really interesting similarities, there are also some marked differences, including differences to how he might see the Hebrew letters in relation to the tarot keys. And then he writes again, there is, however, one exception, which is the arcanum, the Fool, corresponds to the letter Shin, and consequently its number is 21, and its esoteric name is love, amour. I mean, this is, I think, quite humorous of Valentin Tomba, because in this section of Meditations on the Tarot, he's kind of acknowledging that different occult schools have different placements of Hebrew letters with the tarot keys, and it can become quite controversial. If somebody's been studying one method, they think that's correct, and then somebody else comes along and says, well, no. And so on the one hand, he's saying, oh, well, you know, I've got my own ideas, and I'm going to just keep those to myself for the sake of being diplomatic. He then says, but the Fool goes with Shin, and of course that's the most controversial of all the placements, because in the opposing schools there are some people who place the Fool with Aleph. In our school it goes with Shin, and there are very good reasons for that. Many, many reasons. Anyway, the esoteric name of the Fool is love. This, by the way, his understanding of the esoteric name of the Fool being love is something he will have learned from Nina Rodnikova, because her own book, The Solar Way, the Fool Arcanum, is all about this. the Amour. Now, for my own part, when I first read this about Shin, this is my introduction to Kabbalah, to the Hebrew alphabet. I didn't know any of the other letters. So now this letter Shin became imprinted on me. And I realised that he was pointing to a very profound mystery. And so I took this message to heart. And I spent decades of my own ignoring all other possible associations between Hebrew letters and tarot arcana, whilst focusing intensely on Shin and the Fool. With such zealotry, I embarked on the classic Fool's journey through the mystery, magic and mysticism, all in pursuit of this amour, until I was stopped in my tracks by the following statement in the Mebes Tarot Majors course. The Master Mebes did not authorise publication of the Shin element. Now in the Tarot Majors, if you can look at the bottom there, oh yeah, it's out there in big bold letters in the middle of a very interesting, very interesting section right at the pivotal point of the Tarot Majors. And then it just stops. Just when it gets really interesting. And so I thought long and hard about the nature of this Shin element and why it might have been prohibited. But it was not until I truly encountered Shmakov, who makes of Arcanum 0/21, the Fool, Shin, the pivot of his major arcana, that the light began to dawn. For it seemed to me that he had hung his hat upon the fork of the Fool of Shin, explaining in this volume that it is from the soul of this arcanum that all of the others are seeded. This is in contrast with the astral magus Mebes, who, it seems to me at least, could be identified with the first arcanum, the magician. Nina Rudnikova appeared to me as high priestess for the Russian émigré community she rallied in Estonia, whilst the Meditations on the Tarot author might be said to embody the post of hermit, which has a particularly strong emphasis and a magnetic quality in its own tarot exercises. Nicholas Geerse, another GOM initiate and beloved Martinist leader, was something of a hierophant for his devotees in South America. It was he who preserved the coins, swords, cups and wands arcana of the tarot miners for the modern world. All these initiates have passed through the door, where the Emperor stands sentry, the Daleth Arcanum, portal to Darth. So what did the Master Mebes have in mind when he instructed his pupils to publish all they could glean from his Tarot Majors lectures, except for the Shin, this one point? The context for his mysterious statement is a wider denouement of esoteric religious movements throughout the ages, from Krishna to the Rosicrucian revival until Mebes' contemporary age, via Fohi, Hermes Trismegistus, Zoroaster, Orpheus, Moses, Buddha and the Templars. In St. Petersburg, he and his wife, they had a salon where they were teaching people these esoteric subjects, and it was Mebes' wife actually who was the expert in esoteric history, so his book contains a lot of that and it's very interesting. Each age is discussed in terms of the Tetragrammaton, the Yod, He, Vau, He, actually beginning with the point above the Yod, from which is formed a pentagrammaton with the insertion of Shin, Yod, He, Shin, Vau, He, known as the Redeemer Cliche in this school. The word cliche here is a little bit different to how we might understand it ourselves. Explaining this insertion, Mebes says, "It should not be forgotten that religion, so to speak, embodies with the purpose of finding for itself adepts. Because of this, it must have, in addition to elements of the dynamic cycle Yod He Vau He, some kind of magnet, Shin, capable of winning followers, or, in other words, facilitating the penetration and dissemination on the physical plane. This one magnet, besides attracting to the egregore of the religion those who are in tune with it, should also serve as a bond to retain those whose pentagram would be tempted to break the link already established and move away from the egregore. Thus, The first cycle of a religious whirlwind can be expressed by the formula point yod he shin va he, and defined as materialization of the total or partial aspect of the teaching of the one source of truth in order to spiritualize a given environment. The symbolism of the terms of the first cycle of a religious whirlwind can be explained by the following scheme, which could also be called the plan of a religion. The point above the yod corresponds to the purposes of the creation of an egregore. These must be selfless in the broadest sense of the word. The yod itself corresponds to the metaphysical content, which is a general or particular reflection of the one philosophy. The first he is constituted by the state and the conditions of the environment in which the religion is founded. The shin is the aspect of the egregore capable of attracting and retaining adepts. The vow and the cult itself, the child of the environment, fertilized by the principle of esoteric oneness. The second he represents the final link of the first cycle, linking the preceding elements in a family and determining the influence of this family, that is, the influence of the whole current on the external world. This link can be called the politics of a religion, and that explanation can be found in the Geo Meeb's Tarot Major's Arcane 11, Force, page 236. When it's set out in such a way, even though I'd thought about this and puzzled, but when I did this, I saw this set out in such a way, it dawned on me that the taboo shin element of the second Rosicrucian movement that had prohibited could well have been Meebs himself, specifically, and or the Russian Templars in general. Shmakov, for his own part, note the also stood as the magnetic leader of a powerful esoteric order which was destined to survive in the proverbial catacombs of Moscow for long after his departure, taken forward in the equally enigmatic person of Belisutin, known at the time as Moscow's Saint-Germain. In this respect, the order of secrecy becomes self-explanatory, for all these people had reason to fear imprisonment or death if exposed to the Bolshevik authorities, and of course Meebs himself did get sent to a gulag. Rudnikova escaped. She escaped with the retreating imperial army to Estonia. Actually, in amongst her other activities, she became a spy for the White Russian movement. So she was really, really important. She could have been a shin as well, because she was a magnet for those people. She really was, actually. It was thanks to her that the work was saved. So we must never underestimate Nina. Shmakov, similarly, whilst the others were working from St. Petersburg, he was in Moscow. So, and his group survived the longest. A very interesting book, Jacob's Ladder, Kabbalistic Allegory in Russian Literature, helped me join a few more dots in the symbolism of the Fool Arcanum and its pivotal role in the tarot system of so much occult lore. It is well known that the Western mystery tradition in general, and tarot in particular, has forged strong associations with the Hebrew alphabet and Kabbalistic mysticism, drawing upon source texts including the Sefer Yetzirah and the Zohar. It's in the Zohar that a sort of mystical travelogue emerges that would become a cliché literary frame widely used in Christian Kabbalistic texts, first in the West and then in Russia. This book, by the way, was edited by Marina Aptekman in 2011. It's a very good book. For anyone familiar with the Mystic Tarot, this is instantly reminiscent of the legendary Wandering Fool. The wanderer of the Zohar is Rabbi Shimon ben Yohai, who journeys around Palestine meeting various characters and engaging in philosophical and theological discourse. Along with interpretations of Genesis, the Song of Songs, and other sacred texts, are multiple fairy tale features as well, including miraculous donkey drivers, wizards, and wandering desert hermits. The motif of travel is deeply linked to the development of the plot, and the anonymity of most characters signifies their role as everyman engaged in a mystical quest in search of spiritual wisdom. Close quotes. So again, that quote was from Jacob's Ladder, Kabbalistic Allegory in Russian Literature, edited by Marina Aptkaman. I think I'm pronouncing that right. To my mind, her astute analysis is evocative of not just the Fool, but also Don Quixote, some would call him Don Quixote, whom the author of Meditations on the Tarot describes as akin to the Fool, at heart and in spirit, whose esoteric name is Amor. I'm going to quote again from the book, Jacob's Ladder. Early in the 17th century, Christian Kabbalah underwent a number of significant changes. In the majority of Christian Kabbalistic books of this period, Kabbalistic symbolism began to be extensively fused with alchemic imagery. This can be clearly seen in the writings of such popular Hermetic authors of the time as Robert Flood, John Dee, and Abraham von Frankenberg. This is also the period when the Lurianic allegories, particularly the allegory of Adam Kadmon as a metaphysical representation of the Tree of Life, begin to be applied to Christian Kabbalistic works. This image is certainly evident in John Dee's book Mona's Hieroglyphica. Dee's books express for the first time the belief that the synthesis of magic, Kabbalah, and alchemy would produce a new philosophy, the scientific mysticism which would bring a new dawn into the world. For Dee and Flood, as well as for the next wave of Christian Kabbalists represented by Jakob Böhmer, Val Helmont, von Frankenberg, and von Rosenroth, this scientific mysticism meant the union of magic, religion, and science that its adherents found in alchemy. So here we see a blueprint for the present study emerging. For what is the Holy Book of Thoth, if not a serious attempt at creating a ladder that will reach up to heaven on the twin upright posts of science and mysticism, which stretch to infinity above human heads and converge towards a single point of transcendental synthesis in the human eye, the point within the triangle. The Rosicrucian ideology, developed by the Bohemian and German Kabbalists and alchemists of the 17th century, saw a revival of the Fool's Journey. For as occurred in the Zohar, the narrative of the wedding takes place on the road and is woven around the travel experience of the main character, Christian Rosenkreuz. The story incorporates mystical and fairy tale elements that include wandering in deserted, enchanted places and meeting mysterious strangers, and it constantly generates either rejoicing and delight or fear and terror in the reader, who is engaged in a sense of mysterious expectation. Another Kabbalistically inspired Fool's Journey appeared in Russia in 1675, Abraham von Frankenberg's Raphael, Order Arzt Engel, Raphael, the Doctor Angel. Just as the Messianic movement reached a crescendo amongst the persecuted Jews of Europe and other Jewish communities which longed for relief and dearly hoped to see the fulfillment of their Messianic prophecies come to fruition at that time. So much for the Shin element, which I invite you to ponder for yourself if you are going to study this work. Now, what more can we say about the champion of the Fool, the metaphysical genius who bequeathed to us the Holy Book of Thoth, with all its awesome synthesis of sacred scripture and philosophy, spanning the abyss between the Vedas and the Talmud, the Zohar and the Upanishads, Blavatsky and Spinoza, with a relentless intensity forged in the uncompromising degrees of occult praxis. Predictably perhaps, given the well-documented purging of the Russian intelligentsia in general, and occult schools in particular, there is little surviving information about his life, about Shmakov's life. We know that he was born in Moscow in the 1880s, 1887 according to one testament, and died while still quite a young man in Argentina in 1929. He was highly educated in the outer world as well as the inner, being a railway engineer by profession. He displayed a lifelong passion for esoteric philosophy and spirituality, which in the pneumatic world of fin de siècle Russian high society attracted a group of like-minded souls to his salon. He was still living in Russia as late as 1923, a year after Stalin came to power, where he stood at the centre of an esoteric circle of approximately 12 regular members, and a few secondary figures. The pressures of the Stalinist regime soon proved too great, however, and in 1924 he left the Soviet Union with his surviving family, moving first to Germany, then Prague, in some accounts Switzerland, before finally settling in Argentina and remaining there until his death. It seems he had small children with him when he arrived in Argentina, presumably also a wife, but it's not been possible for anyone that I know of to trace his movements there. He published two major works, in his relatively short lifetime. The present volume, the Holy Book of Thoth, Great Arcane of the Tarot, in 1916s, and the Fundamentals of Pneumatology in 1922. After a 70-year hiatus, his works were republished in Ukraine, and later again in Russia. Another title, The Law of Synercy and the Doctrine of the Dual Hierarchy of the Monads and Multitudes, materialized in Kiev in 1994. The outline ideas of Synechi were presented by Shmakov in early articles which appeared in German philosophical journals prior to 1916. He is also thought to have outlined a work entitled The Basic Laws of the Archaeotronics of the World Unity, a binary, ternar and quaternion, but the text of this latter, if it exists at all, has not yet surfaced. So you can see this man's brain was on another level. Sometimes, when I'm reading this, sometimes I find myself reading one sentence about 10 times before it sinks in. Maybe I have attention deficit disorder, but it's can be complicated. The Law of Synercy is central to Shmakov's cosmology, underlying his attempts to synthesize immense cultural fields of philosophy, spirituality, myth and religion, spanning the globe from east to west into a cohesive universal whole. Synergy is thus considered to be a cosmic prototype of being itself, of becoming, and corresponds to the archetype of Sophia, the divine feminine principle, bearer of the divine plan and world mind. Like so much occult philosophy, the law of Synergy is revealed through antinomies, the resolution of which is the key emetic task expressed in the 9th Arcanum, the Hermit of Meditations on the Tarot, and fulsomely described throughout the whole of Geomebs' and Nina Rudnikova's work, as well as the present volume. The binary laws of Synergy are the law of unity and its antithesis, the law of hierarchy. The antinomy is resolved as the hierarchy is ascended, with a unification of lower elements attained in successive upper levels via a mysterious processes of attainment which we see unfolding in the Holy Book of Thoth and the later works. This is the resolution of binaries via a transcendental synthesis, the gift of black perfection, the act of drawing light from darkness. The higher a seeker ascends, the more they are able to truly reflect the universal source of unity, as more false binaries are discerned and destroyed. This is a very important teaching. As Nina Rudnikova writes in The Solar Way, the problems of the human spirit and its search are reduced to the correct setting of the poles. The poles that are correct in relation to each other are called binaries. Incorrect binaries lead to philosophical confusion and form a fantastic worldview that does not correspond to cosmic reality and therefore remains an empty abstraction. The practice of the correct opposites, binaries, in one's activity and life is called the art of living. From the statements of poles which do not correspond to each other, all wrong and groundless worldviews follow, and from the application of such worldviews in life, only an incorrect karmic confusion can result, burdening the individual paths of human evolution. In the philosophy of Shmakov, the human being alone is able to penetrate all stages of the cosmic hierarchy of being and to rectify them into their synthetic unity. To fulfill the law of Synerchi is, therefore, he would say, the cosmic mission of humanity. Synerchi, by the way, is the opposite of anarchy. Politically. The interchangeable qualities of the concept of Synechi and the archetype of Sophia are discernible in Shmakov's thinking, with its strong orientation towards the divine feminine principle. In Foundations of Pneumatology, he considers Sophia in relation to that most occult Sephira, Darth, whilst Isis and Astarte are presented as binary goddess forms, analogous to the Holy Spirit and avidya, or ignorance, respectively. First coming to light in human souls through biblical and Gnostic sources, including the Wisdom of Solomon and the Pistis Sophia, the great feminine archetype has a long history of devotion in Russia. She was especially popularised by Vladimir Solovyov, who lived 1853 to 1900, and Pavel Florensky, who lived 1882 to 1937, both of whom are quoted on numerous occasions in this present volume. One of Shmakov's fellow esotericists, sorry, my mouse is falling down. One of Shmakov's fellow esotericists and students, Vsevolod Belosutin, who lived 1899 to 1943, wrote that different Moscow mystics gathered around Shmakov. Sometimes they appeared and then disappeared again from Shmakov's horizon. Among them there was the famous mystic priest Pavel Alexandrovich Florensky. According to Belosutin, Shmakov was assisted in his escape from Russia by the first president of Czechoslovakia, Thomas Masaryk. There's quite a large footnote to this. Thomas did have a history of helping artistic types to flee Bolshevik Russia, so this notion may or may not be true, but it's certainly credible. So, he granted personal pensions to some prominent figures in the immigrant Russian writers community. So Belosutin's suggestion was certainly plausible, even if we can't verify it. Konstantin Bermstrov supplies some interesting insights into these interrelationships in his essay Esotericism in Soviet Russia in the 1920s and 1930s, where he examines the order of Orion Chimerion, the order of the Moscow Rosicrucians and Manichaeists. Founded by Shmakov in 1916, the order was restructured around the leadership of Belosutin in 1926, 2 years after Shmakov's departure from Moscow. This order operated until 1933, 2 years after the... Okay, sorry, the text is... I'm getting myself... So, it operated until 1926, 2 years after Shmakov departed, and then it kept on going until 1933 when it was destroyed by the NKVD, the secret police. They did not, however, confiscate its archives, which were preserved within private collections, meaning that considerably more is known about this particular occult order compared with most of the others in Russia at that time. Some of its members, in fact, were active until the 1970s, and they these people published things like crazy, a bit like I've been doing. They published books in they self-published it. It's called Samizdat, where copies of text were circulated to people who were trusted in order to keep them alive. So during his own final arrest in 1940, Belosutin made various statements about Shmakov, who he had first met in 1923. He said that he'd become a member of Shmakov's magical circle, which also included, alongside Florensky, the art historian A. Sidorov, Bishop A.N. Semiganovsky, the anthroposophist Sizov, and others. Belisutin and Shmakov cannot have practiced for long together, as the latter left for Germany in 1924. Nevertheless, Belisutin, by all accounts a figure of quite some power and charisma, was prepared to be his successor. Bermistrov accepts the widely held idea that Shmakov, who he describes as one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of Russian occultism, was the generally accepted spiritual leader of various Rosicrucian organisations in the early 1920s, reinforcing the possibility that he was indeed the enigmatic Shin element mentioned or not mentioned by the students of Mebes who published the Tarot Arcana lectures. Members of the highly secretive Orion Chemorion, might as well get it right, known as Knights, engaged in ceremonial as well as theoretical magic, including elemental work and methods of contact with the astral plane called the twin consciousness. This was the order of which Belisutin, who had the illustrious epithet of the Russian Saint Germain, assumed leadership. Some former members of Shmakov's circle, all professional occultists affiliated with other occult organisations, stayed with this revised order, with Belisutin in a central chamber of the esoteric catacombs, especially given that by this time Mebes was arrested. So Mebes was arrested and in 1926 sent to the Gulag, the White Sea Gulag, and this was the year that Belisutin assumed his leadership position. So there was always a magus at the centre in Russia. The raison d'etre of the order was to prepare members for the highest possible degree of Rosicrucian initiation, as it was understood at that time, which was an idea he began to develop while still in contact with Shmakov. And I've only familiarised myself slightly with Belisutin's own work, but he goes into an incredibly creative astral zone, very personal, very dynamic, and incredibly creative, and he really begins to merge the teaching with art. And as it got closer to the Cold War period, also merged into what became, I would say, the Russian Cosmism movement. So, after 3 months in custody, Belisutin appears to have escaped the NKVD with minimal injury to himself, partly thanks to the scruples of others who were arrested but did not betray their leader. And even though Belisutin did give them quite a lot of information, it was mostly about people who'd gone, or who were dead, and who were already out of danger. So, I don't think we can blame him for this. He gave them information they already knew. Shmakov had already long gone, so it's fine. And thanks to him making these statements, we know something about Shmakov. So up until its final destruction in the spring of 1933, the order created a vast number of manuscripts, which were preserved by the youngest member, the artist Valentin Monin, who lived 1904 to 1972, and he managed to evade arrest as well. Bermistrov reports that this extensive archive includes a document entitled The First Transitional Circle of Reason of Hermes, where the history of Russia is perceived as a battleground between forces of light and darkness. Surely, as it must have looked to so many of those who had to live through the horrors of the revolution years and beyond, which reflected the Gnostic cosmology of the world itself as a battleground between principles of good and evil. And isn't it amazing that 200 years later this is exactly what is still happening in Russia and Ukraine? And if we think that this is an undercurrent of Russian thought which has persisted throughout the decades, it will give us some idea of the mentality of our brothers and sisters in the East right now. So, just a sip of water if you don't mind. Oh. Did you know that the tarot is a philosophical machine? The fascinating website prepared by Viktor Olsufiev, who I'll call Victor prior to his death, and I do talk a bit about who Victor is in the footnotes, is one of the best sources of information about the life and work of Shmakov, parts of whose legacy and archive he was fortunate enough to see firsthand. Here we are informed that Shmakov graduated as a midshipman in his youth and wrote a treatise on the history of astronomy. The pearl of the archive was considered to be Shmakov's own occult diary, which survived alongside his author copies of the Holy Book of Thoth and the Law of Synercy, GOM's lectures on the Arcane, which he had prior to their publication, and a preface to Pneumatology, which did not appear in the book itself. The preface to Pneumatology appears to have been 2 typewritten pages in which Shmakov apologises for the poor quality of the publication, saying, "It was very difficult to work in the current conditions. It seems that I had to live in the basement and eat potatoes." Bear in mind, he came from quite a wealthy family. Obviously, by that point, he was living alone outside his family's protection. There was also a typed document which began with the mysterious words, "Ben Alaman fell asleep," of which Victor also recalls the beginning, because Victor has read all this. Victor was a lucky chap from that point of view. So Victor recalls, it said, "Ben Alaman fell asleep. At this very time, the first cry of the newborn was heard. A boy was born who was named Vladimir Shmakov. All his life he expected or was afraid that Ben Alaman would wake up and incarnate. And so in a distant country, among a noisy feast in the circle of relatives and friends, being in the prime of his years, he suddenly fell lifeless. Ben Alaman woke up." So this, I don't want to extrapolate too much, but this sounds as if this is Shmakov referring to what he believed to be one of his past lives. This legend was told to Victor by Shmakov's friend Zhdanov, with whom he confided his interest in the occult from the beginning, and I think there's actually a dedication to this friend in this book. Victor believed a certain Fyodor Petrovich Verevin had been the owner of the Shmakov archive, and that shortly before his death he divided it into 3 parts and gave portions to 3 different people. The occult diary is described as a large, thick volume printed on heavy paper or board. Within the handwritten text at the beginning, representing the start of Shmakov's occult career, were many varied cuttings, including an autograph of Thomas Edison. Later pages included typewritten sheets posted onto the pages using pre-revolutionary typescript. What really amazed Victor was the short space of time it took Shmakov to complete an absolutely massive amount of work, and he was very young, so he died. I'm 47, so he died before that age, and he'd already written all this stuff. So Victor says, "From the moment when Vladimir Shmakov became interested in the occult to the writing, or rather publication, of his Arcana, passed such a short time that I could not believe my eyes. I don't remember exactly, but I think it was 2 years. If we take into account the number of sources that he used, then it is incomprehensible to the mind how it was possible for such a period of time even just to read these books, not to mention to comprehend them, and even more so to create a harmonious system of views. This convinced me even more that Shmakov was an outstanding person." Yeah, indeed. Because, there's over 800 citations in this book, so it's just mind-boggling, really. Victor later tried to track down a second part of the Shmakov archive, which had been given to a man known to friends as the General, and he had taken them to Georgia. Victor met the General's widow in Moscow, where she told him that after the death of her husband, his brother loaded the entire library and archives onto a truck and took them to a city in the North Caucasus. "Imagine, he even took away the hereditary Rosicrucian cross," she told Victor. The third part of the archive was impossible to trace. So a truck. So a third of the archive was carried away on a truck. That's the size of the archive, yeah? This is massive. Victor also raises the thorny topic of Shmakov's father, okay? A.S. Shmakov, who he describes thus: a well-known lawyer, writer and apologist for anti-Semitism in Russia. I think we need to acknowledge this. He is known in particular for his active participation on the prosecution side in the notorious Baylis case. Shmakov's father was very educated. He had an excellent library, inherited, I think, by his son, in various fields, especially Jewish matters. In particular, there are many books on Jewish mysticism and Kabbalah. Presumably, Shmakov found these books useful. Here's how it goes. The father is an anti-Semite, but the son is a Kabbalist. Why not? It used to happen that the father is a communist, but the son was a dissident. By 1989, Victor was immersed in his other life, in the footnotes, and published an article about Russian and Soviet sheet music covers, which mentioned the artist Basil Matsushin, who I mentioned as having the tarot pictures here. And Matsushin was a student of Shmakov and creator of the tarot images which adorned the original Holy Book of Thoth and which are reproduced at the head of each arcanum of the present volume. The article won Victor an invitation to give a report on the topic at a conference in Russian art held at the Johns Hopkins University in Washington. Upon his arrival, Victor received a letter by Dr. W. Werner concerning Mikhail Vasilyevich Matsushin, who stood at Matsushin, who stood at the head of one of the three schools of the Russian avant-garde in St. Petersburg. The other two, by the way, were led by artists called Malavik and Filanov. A correspondence was struck up between the doctor and Victor, and the name of Shmakov soon arose, in which Dr. Werner informed him of letters written by Shmakov to Matsushin from Buenos Aires. So they were clearly friends. The searches which followed unfortunately failed to reveal either the letters themselves or any information at all about Shmakov's life in Argentina, sadly. One day Victor was introduced to a very old and kind gentleman called Sergei Alexandrovich Raevsky, who wrote occult books that were influenced by the philosophy of Shmakov. Raevsky told him something very interesting along the lines of, "Did you know that the tarot is a philosophical machine?" By laying out the arcana in different ways, different philosophical systems can be obtained. This idea made a deep impression on Victor, for whom the tarot, he says, was some kind of magical door in the wall. Raevsky's words turned out to be like a seed that slumbered in me, waiting in the wings to rise. Another such seed is associated with the Majorcan philosopher, theologian, poet and Christian missionary Raymond Lull, who lived around 1232 to around 1315 or 16, one of the most important forefathers of the entire occult tradition with which we are occupied. It was in search of Raymond Lull that the author of Meditations on the Tarot made his last journey, dying at the tomb of the legendary occultist at the age of 73. Given the immense central importance of Raymond Lull to the primordial tradition, we have included an extended appendix containing details of the philosophical system he created, which is known as the Great Art, Ars Magna, which expressed a sort of universal logic to prove the truth of Christian doctrine in any situation. Ars Magnus consists of general principles and combined mechanisms functioning as a sort of philosophical machine. So central is Raymond Lull to the work in question that it's worth bearing in mind some of the foundations of Ars Magna whilst we attempt to push open the magical doorway that Victor discovers. Victor explains further. Those who have studied Ars Magna by Lull know that he had two systems, one based on 3 and 9, the other based on 4 and 16. He refers to static and dynamic 3, Turner, 4, Quaternary. He refers to static and dynamic models of the tarot, the latter being the more complex and not very well known to any researchers. By the way, Shmakov's system also included static and dynamic models. It's not about how successful his attempt was. What matters is the right direction. In a static picture, time does not exist. The picture lies outside of it. Dynamic tarot develops in time, that is, it moves, is in perpetual motion. A static model can be built and studied piece by piece. The dynamic model is complete. Either you know it completely, or you do not know it at all. This knowing is dependent upon the intuition of the walker and seer, a gift which the author of Meditations on the Tarot takes great pains to stimulate and nurture for that very reason. All that remains for you, dear reader, is to push open the door in the wall that little bit further. So, well, been going for quite a while now, so when I do the next Shmakov presentation, I'll start to go into his actual tarot teachings, but for now, that's the introduction. I hope it will suffice. For those of you who've got the book, I'm sorry about the typos. I'm going to point a couple out, okay? In the contents, 22nd Arcana, yeah, it's not another 12, that's my mistake. So 22 does indeed come after 21. And Billy tells me that I've got the 14th Arcanum. Have I called it 4? Have I done something? Oh, I don't know. Anyway, there's another typo somewhere. It's not me trying to mysteriously lead people astray. It's just I didn't have a proofreader to help me do it, so I'm sorry about that. Okay. Until later.